Hi there. Can I just check you can hear me okay before I go on? Can you just write in the chat if you can hear me? Perfect. Brilliant. So welcome to session 2 on the cardiovascular system. I'll just pop the next slide up. We're basically carrying on where we left off, looking at the cardiovascular system. Last session, we had a look at the heart, which is the pump, and we also had a look at some components of the blood. So what I'd like you to do before we do anything else in today's session is have a think about the function of the blood. What's it carrying around our bodies? What can you come up with? See if you can write a list. You can put it in the chat if you like. If not, just write what you can down. What is in the blood? What is it carrying? What's it transporting around our body? And then I'll have a look if you pop it in the chat. You don't have to write in the chat. Oxygen, really good, Lana. That's probably the most important thing because we can't store that anywhere. So there's something else which is really, really important as oxygen, but we can store that. So that's not such a big deal if we don't get it constantly. We can store it, but it's a big deal transporting it. So oxygen is definitely a key reactant that we need for something. And there's one other component that we really, really need to. See if you can think what that might be. I can see. Let me see if I can skip down the messages. 1 minute. There we go. So oxygen we're transporting. There's some other things as well. Anything else you can remember that we're moving around the body? Carbon dioxide gets excreted. Excellent. We need to get rid of that because it will turn our blood quite acidic if we don't get rid of it. Good. So we've got our gases from gas exchange. We're going to have a look at gas exchange as part of this unit there. So oxygen in, carbon dioxide out. So oxygen's a reactant for this really important reaction, and carbon dioxide is a product. So carbon dioxide gets made, and it's actually a waste product, which is why we've got to get rid of it. So those are two parts of this key reaction that I'm getting to. So what else do we need that's really important to keep us going day to day? Oxygen, definitely. What else does our body desperately need? Water is one thing, but something else as well. Don't worry about scientific terms. Energy, good. Where do we get our energy from? Food, yeah. So oxygen is one of the key things that we need to keep us going. The other key thing is glucose from our food. And these two things react together in our cells, oxygen plus glucose. They react to give carbon dioxide, which is the waste product of the reaction, and water. So we need this reaction to take place in our cells to keep them going, to keep them alive, or otherwise we can't do all of the cellular processes that we need our body to do. And that is why we have this circulatory system. We need to transport that oxygen from our lungs to the cells within our tissues. They cannot survive without this reaction between oxygen and the glucose from our food, because we have no energy in our cells if this reaction doesn't take place. So this is why the cardiovascular system is so important. The circulatory system, part of it, taking this glucose and the oxygen around the body. There's loads of other stuff that goes as well. We've talked a little bit about the fact that there's hormones in our blood. It distributes the heat, so keeps us warm on our, well, hopefully in our hands and our toes, and not just, you know, the core bit of our body. It helps distribute the body heat. So there's lots of other things that are in our blood. There's all of the defense from our white blood cells as well. There's so much stuff that is in our blood. But the key thing is that oxygen and that glucose that we need to get to our cells, and we need to get it to every single cell so it can carry out a special reaction called respiration or cellular respiration that we're going to have a look at later on in a couple of lessons. So we need to get these reactants, oxygen and glucose, all the way through our body. And we're going to have a little look today at how we reach those cells that are sort of deeper into the tissue, maybe, rather than, you know, really close to a blood vessel. So cardiovascular system, session 2. And we're going to have a look at the vessels that transport the blood. So we have, you probably know, arteries and veins. You've probably heard the term arteries and veins, I'd imagine. We spoke a little bit about them going in and out of the heart last session. So they are both big blood vessels. They are slightly different. The arteries take the blood away from the heart and the veins take the blood in. Remember, we said in helps us remember with regards to the heart. So they take the blood in and the arteries take the blood out. Now, they have got some structural similarities, and we can see here that they both have an inner layer, which is smooth. This is made up of endothelium. Then they both have a stretchy layer, which has got muscle and elastic fibers in. And then they've both got an outer layer, which keeps them contained within a structure and stops them sticking to other things. So this outer layer is also smooth, and this muscle, which is inside the veins and arteries, is smooth muscle. So that is different muscle tissue to the muscles that we find in our skeletal system. So our arms and our legs, remember, are that sort of stripy muscle we talked a bit about that we can purposely contract. You know, if we want to pick up a weight, we can do bicep curls. We can't command our arteries and veins to contract. This smooth muscle, like the smooth muscle that lines our esophagus that we talked about when we were talking about peristalsis. So it responds automatically. We can't control it to contract ourselves, but it can be controlled by things like hormones, for example. So the outer layer is connective tissue. So connective tissue that basically surrounds organs, vessels, things like that, keeps them contained and stops them sticking. So we can see some structural similarities. As I said, they've all got the smooth inner layer. They've got this elasticy layer, which has got elastic and smooth muscle in, it stretches, and they've got the connective tissue. So let's have a look at the differences now. The major difference you can see is that the veins have valves. So use that alliteration to remember the two V's, veins and valves. The veins have valves. This is important because it stops the blood flowing backwards in the veins. So once the blood has passed along here, it can't go back because the valves close, which is important. And you might be thinking, well, why is that important in the veins, but not the arteries? Well, remember, the veins go in to the heart. The blood's at lower pressure by the time it's going back to the heart. In the artery, where the blood is going out from the heart, the blood is under high pressure. So you don't need valves. It's not going to flow backwards because it's left that heart with that huge push from the bottom of the ventricles down at the bottom of the heart beats, massive push from the bottom that squeezes the ventricles and pushes that blood all around the body. So there's no need for valves in the artery because the blood's under really high pressure. And as a result, the artery is actually loads thicker here. Doesn't actually look particularly thicker on this diagram, to be honest, but it's loads thicker because of the pressure that the walls are under from that massive push of blood being pumped from that really strong muscle, the heart, around the body. The veins don't need such a thick wall as the artery because they're not under pressure. And we'll have a look at why they're not under pressure in a bit. But the pressure in the artery is huge and that wall is much, much thicker. So as a result, this hole through the artery is actually smaller than it is in the vein because the wall is thick. So more of this space is taken up by the thick wall of the artery. We call this hole in the middle, we call it the lumen, the same as we called the tube in the gut. The hole we call the lumen. That's just the name for the hole in the tube. So in the artery, the lumen is much smaller because the walls are much thicker, because they have to withstand this huge pressure from the heartbeat, this very strong muscle. So differences then in the veins and arteries are: veins have valves, arteries have much thicker walls to withstand the pressure from the heartbeat. And as a result of the thicker walls, they have a narrower lumen. Okay. Now, an important feature of both the veins and the artery is that they have thick walls. Well, there's several layers thick. You can see here is this inner layer, the endothelium, the elastic layer, the elastic fibers and the muscle, and then the connective tissue. So they're pretty thick. There's 4 layers to start with. So we're not going to be seeing any exchange of materials from the blood within the vessels and the tissues. So we're not going to see oxygen diffusing out of the artery into, I don't know, muscle tissue or liver tissue. That can't happen. This is way too thick for oxygen to get through quickly, let alone other things like nutrients. So we're not seeing any exchange between these vessels and tissues. These are primarily to just move blood around the vasculature, which is another word for the vessels. So these layers have unfortunately got some tricky names to learn. So they're all tunica something. So this smooth inner layer is called the tunica intima. So that's sort of like intima to inside. Tunica media is the middle bit, media meaning middle, think median, mean, that sort of thing from maths. So tunica media is the middle. So that includes this strong muscle layer and the stretchy elastic layer. And the tunica externa, think external, outside, is the outside layer, which is the connective tissue layer. So these are the correct terms, unfortunately, to learn: tunica intima, tunica media, and tunica externa. So let's have a look at this diagram. This shows how the arteries and the veins connect to each other within the body. So here's our artery. This is the vessel that the blood would be leaving the heart through. So it's thick. You can see lots of layers, connective tissue, muscles, stretchy bit. This is the elastic bit, and then the endothelium. And then we have the lumen here. Look how narrow the lumen is in the artery compared to the lumen of the vein. So the vein is almost double the diameter than this artery here in the diagram. It's got a much bigger diameter because the wall's not as thick. Look at the thick muscle layer here on the artery. That's because it's got to withstand the heartbeat. And so when the heart beats, the arteries can expand to hold the blood, the sort of like this. And you can feel that as your pulse. That's your pulse, the expanding of the arteries that you can feel. So the blood is going to leave the heart via the artery and travel off around the body. And the artery will branch into these smaller vessels, and these are called arterioles. And these are just sort of smaller, like I said, branches really of the artery. And then eventually these whittle down to much smaller structures, and these are called capillaries. Now, the capillaries are really important to us, to our bodies, because this is how all of this stuff that we were talking about earlier that we desperately need to get to our cells, the oxygen, the glucose, this is how it gets out of our blood. It can leave the capillaries and move into the cells and the tissues. There's another fluid that we have circulating here. It's called, some people call it tissue fluid, which is fine, I use that term, or some people call it interstitial fluid, that's the proper name. So we'll have a look at that in a moment. But all the stuff that we need from our blood can move into this tissue fluid and get to our cells. Then, once everything has been exchanged with our cells, we've got rid of that oxygen that we really need to distribute. We've got rid of that glucose that we really need to distribute. then our blood can pick up the waste, the carbon dioxide, for example, that we need to get rid of, can drain back into these capillaries, move back up to these thicker venules, which are like smaller veins, and back into the veins. And where do the veins go? Back to the heart. Remember, the vein in to the heart. Now, that's great because everything that needs to be removed from the blood, carbon dioxide, for example, can get taken straight from the heart to the lungs and breathed out. There, the blood is going to pick up more oxygen and off it goes through the arteries again. Perfect. Lovely little double circulatory system working. Now, a really important thing that is on this diagram that we haven't looked at yet is the cross-sectional areas. So see this little rectangle? Well, it's not quite a rectangle, is it? It's parallelogram, but you see what I mean. It's see this little shape here? It's showing you the cross-section of the arteriole down here. So if we chopped where that parallelogram, blue parallelogram shape is, that's what the cross-section of the arteriole would look like. So quite big compared to an individual capillary. But if you compare with the cross-section of all of these capillaries here, there's loads of them. So the actual cross-sectional area of the artery is loads smaller than the total cross-sectional area of all of these capillaries. So although the blood is moving from a really big vessel into a smaller vessel, into individually even smaller vessels, the total area of the capillaries is huge. It's as if the blood is going from a small vessel into a massive vessel because there's so many of them. Even though the individual ones are tiny, if you add them all together, the total cross-sectional area is massive. So what that does is it really slows the blood down as it's traveling through. I think we've all got hold of a hose pipe when we're little, playing in the garden, and squeezed it. So we know that if you squeeze a tube that has liquid fluid running through it, and you narrow the end, you can put it under higher pressure. And the reverse is true. If you make the tube bigger, which is exactly what we're doing with this huge cross-sectional area here of the capillaries, rather than squeezing water out, or blood in this case, what you're going to do is slow it down. This massive cross-sectional area of the capillaries slows it down. And that's really good because we want to diffuse oxygen into our tissues and pick up the carbon dioxide back. So that's great. We really slow the blood flow down. Don't forget, it's going so fast when it comes out of the heart. It's under massive pressure. We've got this muscle to keep it under control almost. It's under so much pressure. It's pumped so hard. We need to slow it down, right down to go through the capillaries. Then it comes back to the veins after it's eventually done all of that work in the capillaries. And unfortunately, now we've got a problem because it's not moving fast enough to get back to the heart. So we use our skeletal muscles. That's what the contractions of our legs and arms do. They move the blood back to the heart by sort of pumping the veins almost. And that's why we've got valves in our veins to stop it back flowing, because we've lost all of that pressure while it traveled through the capillaries with this huge cross-sectional area. Okay, so let's have a look at the capillaries themselves. So capillary network has a large volume. Here's the artery branching into the arteriole, and here you can see the capillaries, the venule, which returns to the larger vein. So they have a large combined volume because of the vast number of capillaries. Structural importance of the capillary is they are 1 cell thick. And look how big they are. They are so narrow, red blood cells only just fit through them. They're 1 cell thick. They're made of this endothelium layer only. That's all they are. And they're a really short diffusion distance from the tissues, from the cells. So anything like oxygen that diffuses out of here to the cells, or here, wherever, it's really, really close. So the blood is traveling so slowly through this capillary network because of this massive volume, which slows it down. And that gives loads of time to exchange materials with the tissues in the capillaries. And as I said, the venous pressure in the veins after the blood returns to the veins is insufficient to get the blood back to the heart. So we need to rely on the contraction of the skeletal muscles, and the venous valves prevent backflow or pooling of blood. If you get pooling of blood over many years as you grow old, you can get a condition called varicose veins, which is when the valves stop working and you start to see blood pooling in individual veins. So, systemic circulation involves the blood leaving the heart via the arteries, and it then will return to the heart via the veins. But in the meantime, it has to, as we've just seen, go all around the tissues with the capillaries. But it doesn't just go around tissues in the organs. There has to be, or in anywhere else, you know, connective tissue for that matter. It has to get to specific organs as well. So we have special names for these big vessels going into and leaving the heart. So we've learnt about the pulmonary artery and the pulmonary vein already when we were learning about the heart. Pulmonary means the lungs. So the pulmonary artery takes deoxygenated blood from the heart to the lungs, oxygenates it, and then the pulmonary vein takes the oxygenated blood back to the heart. We've learnt about that as well. We learnt about the vena cava last session, or vena cava, and this is the big vein that drains from the head and the arms and takes the deoxygenated blood back to the heart. We also learnt about the aorta last week, which is the main artery which carries blood from the heart around the body. And we have learnt about the hepatic portal vein, quite a lot about that. We've been talking about it taking the nutrients from the small intestine to the liver, and the fact that there's, you know, the drugs go straight there from the liver and everything that needs to be detoxified. So we have met the hepatic portal vein as well. There's another couple of important ones that we need to learn. There's the hepatic artery, which takes oxygenated blood from the heart to the liver. So the hepatic artery takes the blood to the liver, and the hepatic vein takes deoxygenated blood back from the heart from the liver. And this is obviously going to take the digested food particles as well, like glucose and amino acids, from the liver back to the heart, where it can then be pumped into systemic circulation. So all of that glucose, amino acids that we've picked up from our food can get taken out around the body as well. So pulmonary means the lungs, hepatic means the liver. We've talked quite a bit about the liver when we were doing the digestion topic, and a new one here is renal, and renal is to do with the kidneys. So the renal artery takes oxygenated blood, which is also going to be rich in urea, to the kidneys for excretion. And then when the blood leaves the kidneys, it's going to be low in urea because it's been filtered in the kidneys. We'll talk about that again later. And that goes in the renal vein around the system again. So some important arteries and veins there to learn where they're going and what they're carrying. So if it's coming from the heart, unless it's going to the lungs to get oxygenated, if it's coming from the heart to go around the body, it's full of oxygen. If it's going back to the heart, it's low on oxygen or deoxygenated. Obviously, the lungs are an exception because they do the oxygenating, they do the filling and replenishing with oxygen. The liver is obviously carrying stuff that's full of nutrients because that blood has just come from the digestive system, and the artery and the renal veins and arteries. You need to think about removal of urea for those structures. Okay, let's see how you do with this. Have a go, see how you get on. So which type of blood vessel carries blood away from the heart? Which type of blood vessel carries blood to the organs? Which type of blood vessel has valves inside? And can you remember which chamber of the heart receives the blood from the vena cava? You can put the answers in the chat if you like, or you can just have a go at home. I'll pop them up anyway. Good, well done. Okay, I'll pop the answers up then. So carrying the blood away from the heart is the artery, and it goes to the organs. So that again, that one's the artery. It's the veins that have valves. Remember, use that alliteration to remember it. Veins have valves. And it's, if you think about it, it's the veins, remember, vein to the heart, which are taking the blood back to the heart. So the blood is under really low pressure there because it's just been through that massive cross section of the arteries. So it's under really low pressure. And it is the right side of the heart that receives the blood coming back from systemic circulation. So it's the right atrium that the blood goes in from that big vein. Okay. Have a think. What type of blood vessel carries blood away from the liver? Think about where it's going, if it's going away. Which blood vessel carries blood to the kidney? And which blood vessel carries blood away from the lungs? So that one's a bit tricky. Maybe those last two. See if you can remember. You can write in the chat if you want to, or just scribble down in your rough notes. Good, well done. Okay, I will pop the answers up for you. So it is the vein which is taking the blood away from the liver. Well, from everything, really. Remember, because it is the vein that's taking it into the heart. And it is the renal artery that takes the blood to the kidneys, and the pulmonary that goes to the lungs, away from the lungs as well. Pulmonary is to do with the lungs. Okay, so let's have a better look at this endothelium of the capillary then. So the capillary just has that one layer, that endothelial layer. The red blood cells barely fit through. And you can see these cells here. The junctions actually in the capillary are really not very tight at all. And the white blood cells can squeeze out, as we will see in a moment, between those cells. So they're really, really small, and they have to be because they need to fit between the cells. And every cell in the body is within 100 micrometers of a capillary, which is really quite a small distance. They've got an extremely narrow lumen, as I've said. And this is the key place because this is where we exchange the gases that are really important. We talked about carbon dioxide and oxygen, waste like urea, and hormones, waste like carbon dioxide as well, obviously. Hormones between the blood and tissues, obviously glucose too. So nearly all of the components of blood can leave through these tiny little junctions between the cells. So that's all the white blood cells. That's really important because those white blood cells, they're out, they're in the interstitial fluid, they can move into the tissues and they can survey the tissues for infection. So it's really important they can move in and out. It's a key part of the immune response, their ability to be distributed around the body and move in and out of those cells. And obviously, everything that's dissolved in the plasma can move in and out as well. So how does it move in and out? Well, the white blood cells can move towards signals. They can easily squeeze by changing shape in between these junctions of the cells. But the tissue fluid, or the plasma from the blood, moves out because the pressure is greater within the capillary than it is in the tissue. So that pressure just forces the fluid to leave. It just moves to where there's less pressure. And I just want to show you this video. Let's hope it works. Apologies in advance if there are adverts. Hope not, because I think when you're looking at processes in biology, it often helps to see an animation of it or a video of it, because it's something that's moving and it's much easier to understand if you can see the moving pictures rather than try to explain it slide by slide. Apologies for the ads, guys. Okay, so what you notice from that video, hopefully, is the mention of something called lymph. I'll just get that back on slideshow mode. So where is this lymph coming from? What's happening, as we said, in the capillary is we're losing a lot of the blood components into the tissue, the interstitial fluid. So out of this, these small little gaps, these junctions, we're losing white blood cells. We saw them squeeze out in the video. We're losing plasma, everything essentially, but the blood cells and actually the platelets can't move out. So everything else will move into the tissues. This is great. This, you know, the blood slows down. The fact that it's slow allows loads of exchange to happen, and the pressure, which is greater in the capillaries compared to the tissues, allows this exchange of materials. That's great. Some of this stuff is trapped. The red blood cells can't get out. The platelets can't get out. Not all of the plasma goes out, and this goes off back to the heart. But we've got a little bit of a problem. If the pressure is greater in the capillaries and it causes the plasma to squeeze out and become interstitial fluid or tissue fluid, how are we going to get it back in? Well, we can't, because we're relying on the pressure difference to get it out. We can't just magically get it back in by here. So we have to get it back another way. And there's actually another network of vessels called the lymphatic system, which is how we get this fluid back out of the tissues into circulation. So let's have a look at the lymphatic system. So the tissue fluid is at lower pressure than the blood in the capillaries, so it can't return to the blood vessels. You can't force it back in because it's at low pressure. It just won't squeeze back in. If anything, just if there's a pressure differential with a higher pressure in the capillaries, that's going to squeeze the content of the capillaries out. So what we need to do is collect it some other way, and the lymphatic vessels in green. And what happens is the tissue drains into these vessels of the lymphatic system. Once it's in there, so people talk about blood, interstitial fluid, and lymph fluid as if they're all different things. They're kind of not. They're kind of a few little bits of variation. They're just what we call it when we find it in different. When it's inside the blood vessels, like the veins, the arteries, and the capillaries, it's got red blood cells in. Once it is in the tissues, it's interstitial fluid. Once that lymphatic system, we now call it lymphatic fluid or lymph. So the lymphatic fluid is moving in these lymph vessels that you can see in green here, and it's returned to vein, which is up by your clavicle. That's the name for your God, I can't remember what it is. Anyway, the subclavian vein is under that's the one. Yeah. So your subclavian vein is just up under there. At really, really low pressure. It's the lowest pressure point in the circulatory, because it's a great distance, not from the heart physically, left the heart at high pressure over here. The aorta is where it leads the way around the body, comes back through the circulatory system by really low pressure by the time it gets back over here. So that's the lowest. That's where we can drain the lymphatic system back into the low pressure point is. So we don't have to fight the pressure gradients. The vein allows the lymphatic fluid to be returned to circulation as. So there you go. Subclavian means below the clavicle. Remember, the collarbone is the name I was struggling to remember. I'm reading subclavian and going, yeah, the name? Collarbone. So yeah, it's just under the collarbone. So we're going to, and fingers crossed there's no ads this time. Apologies in advance if there are. These are the capillaries. So have a look at the junctions between the cells of the capillaries. Fit in junctions like a lot of the epithelial tissue we've been looking at. There's big, and you can see the white blood cells leaving here. Okay. So I'll just leave it on that for a minute, not slideshow. So subclavian obviously comes from the word clavicle, which is the proper name for the collarbone. So subclavian beneath the clavicle. But one of the really important things there was the white blood cells in the lymphatic system. So you might have heard people say, "Oh, my lymph nodes are swollen." You might have said heard people say that, you know, when you catch a cold or you're not very well, people say, oh, my glands are up, and say that it's their lymph nodes they're referring to. The white blood cell activity in those nodes where those lymph vessels sort of group together is really important. I'm not sure if you caught it in the video, but the narrator said that they are antigen presenting sites, these lymph nodes. So last couple of sessions, we talked about antigen presentation, how these antigens are presented by the macrophage. Remember saying, look, this is the well, not parasite, the pathogen that we have found. We've chopped it all up. This is what its proteins look like. And they present those proteins, the macrophages present them to the other immune cells. So these are really key, important places where the immune system can get activated. And also you might have noticed that they are sites where the pathogens can be held as well. So they can help reduce the spread of this infection around the body. So that's quite a key, important thing as well. Okay, let's crack on. So a couple of questions to check your understanding so far. Which of the following is not a component of the lymphatic fluid? In the head, in which area of the body is the subclavian vein? And which of the following is not transported in the blood? And where is the blood pressure greater? That's a bit tricky, number 3, actually. It's not actually, yeah, that number 3 is a bit of a tricky one. It's not worded great. So apologies for that. It's my fault. I wrote it. Have a guess. See if you can work your way through. You can pop your answers up if you like, and I can have a look, or you can just try it at home. So what's not in the lymphatic fluid? What's being held back in the capillaries? Where's that subclavian vein? Which is not really transported in the blood so much, or at least as far as we're concerned. And where is the blood pressure greatest? I'll give you a minute and then I'll pop the answers up. Okay, so the following is not a component of lymphatic fluid. It is the red blood cells. It is, they're stuck in the capillary. They can't get out. The white blood cells squeeze through those junctions where they're not particularly tight, and the plasma can move easily in and out. That's what becomes basically the fluid of the tissue fluid. The subclavian vein is underneath the collarbone, and what is not transported so much in the blood is the polysaccharides. They're broken down into their smaller subunits like glucose for transport, the carbohydrates. And the blood pressure is the greatest. It's the greatest in the arteries, which leave the heart, and it's the veins that return to the heart. So it's at low pressure, and obviously the capillaries and the tissues are at lower pressure as well. Okay, so while we're on this topic, it's important to understand diseases of this circulatory system, because it's quite a common system to cause death, because it's really so important. So if our heart stops working, for example, via a heart attack, we are unable to transport that oxygen and glucose around to our muscles and other tissues. So it's important to understand what happens there. So this is a diagram of the heart, and you can see this vessel here. This isn't the blood going through the heart. It's not the vena cava and the aorta and the pulmonary vein and the pulmonary artery that we looked at last session, but it's the heart's own blood supply. The heart is a muscle, so it needs its own oxygen and it needs its own glucose. So it gets supplied with blood. It can't just dip into the blood that's going through it to be pumped. It has its own blood supply. And if this blood supply stops, the heart stops beating and we can have a heart attack situation. So if we had a look at this blood vessel here, it's called the coronary artery. This is the artery which supplies the heart with its own oxygenated blood and glucose. If that gets blocked up with a blood clot because there's cholesterol building up in the sides of the vessel, then it can block the blood supply to the heart. And obviously that's not going to be a good thing. So the coronary arteries are some of the most narrow arteries in our body, which is not great because it means they're really easily blocked. And a buildup of fatty substances such as cholesterol in the walls of the artery can cause narrowing or blockage if we get a blood clot. And it can also lead to hardening of the arteries, and this is called atherosclerosis. So if this happens and the blood supply to the heart muscle is reduced, what happens is the first thing that happens is the person who's experienced it might get chest pain. That's called angina. And this is due to these fatty deposits, the plaque blocking the artery. And eventually this could lead to a complete blockage. And if the artery is blocked, the oxygen supply to the heart may be cut off. And then that heart muscle will stop contracting because that muscle itself needs oxygen and glucose to get the energy it needs to contract. So if that heart muscle can't contract, we have a heart attack, which is otherwise known as a myocardial infarction. If a large part of that muscle is affected, not infected, it can be fatal. However, if it's just a small bit, so like a little end bit, the patient can recover. If it's a big block in somewhere up here, major part, then you can die really easily. So a number of factors increase the risk of coronary heart disease. So high blood pressure or hypertension means that the blood has to pump really hard to get that blood around the body. So it's working extra hard, puts a huge strain on it. Diet is obviously always lifestyle choices. Diets. So if you have a diet that's really high in saturated fats, this can increase blood cholesterol levels and they can form plaques on the arteries. So saturated fat comes from meat and dairy. Unsaturated fat comes from like olive oil. So things like olive oil, for example, are really good. Things that are saturated and fats and cholesterol. A while ago when we were talking about the cell membrane, more unsaturated fats you have, the better and flexible. But if you have a diet high in saturated fat, generally you need to have a plant-based diet to remain healthy. The science says your genetics is a factor. If you have a close family member with coronary, suffer from it, and that favorite lifestyle factor for cigarettes and smoking. So nicotine in cigarettes actually constricts your pressure. This increases the heart rate. It increases carbon monoxide, which is poisonous, and that reduces the amount of oxygen get into the heart as well. So smoking is just bad on so many levels for supplying this particular organ with blood. Exercise really helps to limit the effect of any of these other lifestyle choices. Helps strengthen the heart. Stress is obviously not good because hormones released during stress can constrict the blood vessels, and this can again increase blood pressure, which we saw is not a good thing. And diabetes also is problematic because if you can't regulate your blood sugar levels, what happens is you end up with more fatty deposits in the arteries, such as leads to these plaques and blockages. Okay. These are quite easy questions, but we'll have a little look at them just before the end. So what is the primary cause of coronary heart disease? What supplies the heart muscle with oxygen? And what term is used to describe the narrowing or blockage of the coronary artery? So just have a go. You don't have to write in the chat if you don't want to, but you can do, and I can see your answers then. But have a go at home if not. Good. Well done. Okay, I'll just pop the answers up for us. So the cause of coronary heart disease is the blockage of the artery. The other three options there are risk factors. So overeating, lack of exercise, high blood pressure. They're not direct causes, but they're risk factors. What supplies the heart muscle with oxygen? It is the coronary artery. Those other vessels, the aorta and pulmonary artery, are to do with the blood vessel through the blood flow through the heart, through those chambers, the atria and ventricles. So nothing to do with supplying the heart muscle itself with blood. And the term to describe the narrowing or blockage of the coronary arteries is coronary artery disease, when it actually closes off and causes a lack of blood to get to the heart completely. It's myocardial infarction, heart attack. Okay, a couple more questions then. What causes atherosclerosis? What is a symptom of a partially blocked coronary artery? And what are the fatty deposits in the arteries called? And then we're almost done. I know it's quite intense, these sessions. It's good practice for your lectures when you get to uni, though. Good, well done. Okay, I will pop the answers up for us. So atherosclerosis is a buildup of the fatty substances in the walls, and the pain, the symptom is called angina. That's the pain you feel from the stress that the heart is under. And the fatty deposits are called plaques. The fatty deposits in the arteries are called plaques. Okay. I think we will stop there. It's a good place to stop because we're 1 minute to the end, and we will have a look at the electrical conduction of the heart next session. So well done. Good effort tonight, guys. And I will see you on Thursday. Bye, everyone. Bye.